Okay, so let's do the lecture number 8, Rethinking the Marriage Theme. I am Terry Wolf. I wrote that book right there, Maybe Everyone is Wrong, Revelations, Conspiracy, and the Kingdom of Heaven. I'm not an expert on anything. I'm not making any factual claims. This is all my personal speculation. I could be wrong, but I have varying degrees of confidence. I think even experts would admit that if they were telling the truth. And the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 2A, guarantees religious freedom, and I am going to be doing exactly that, declaring my religious beliefs. So the question I want to start off with here, because we've gone through the first part of Revelation, but I know at the very end of Revelation, and you should know this too, there is a wedding that takes place, and that kind of connects, if you've been paying attention to what I've said, Revelation clarifies the rest of the Bible. It's not the other way around. You don't have to go to Genesis to figure out what happens in Revelation as much as you need to go to Revelation to figure out what was happening in Genesis. That might be an overstatement, but that's sort of the way I'm trying to think about it. So how does the theme of marriage connect Revelation to the rest of the Bible? So I think it's pretty obvious. In Revelation, the final event is a great wedding. In Genesis, the first man, when we meet Adam, he soon needs a wife. So right there you have a connection. The entire Bible, in fact, if you think about it, not as the Bible, but as reality, because that's what we should be thinking about it as, reality as we know it, creation as we know it, ultimately leads to this marriage that happens in Revelation. And Genesis, the first thing that really Adam does, he names the animals, but the purpose of naming the animals is basically to show him that he doesn't have a counterpart and he needs to have somebody made out of himself who is his counterpart, that he is made for him specially. So already we have the beginning of mankind and the end, essentially, of this world, because new heaven and new earth is a different world, a new creation altogether. Creation itself ends with this marriage. Very interesting. The parallels and contrast between Jesus Christ and patriarchs in the Old Testament is well explored by other people, as is the notion of the church being his bride, and also that of Jerusalem being his bride. That's not really what I'm going to talk about today, because I want to deal more with marriage itself in the Bible. We know that Israel was often called a harlot in the Old Testament, said to be fornicating when it chased after other gods. So there we have the feminine introduction of the city and the idea of it, a city somehow being unfaithful. Now the city slash people tribe are, it's all Israel, because a tribe occupies a city, or a city-state, as it would have been, a city that controls the territory around it. And they are on the move. They have their tabernacle. They're going through the wilderness, all these things. But ultimately, Israel is this place that gets established, and it fornicates, and it goes after other gods. And God says that. But I think that description of it fornicating and what that means biblically is misunderstood, and we're missing the full picture. So that's what I want to revisit. This is Rethinking Marriage, the marriage theme. So by applying our modern marriage notion to this ancient narrative, we distort everything that's actually being said in that story of Israel and these early fathers, and how it all ties in ultimately with Revelation. So let's re-examine the way the ancient relationships typically worked. And once we see the way that relationships really worked back then, as far as I'm gathering from whatever I can research and from the Bible, we're going to appreciate more what God was trying to do and what he is going to do and has been doing with the prophecies, with Jesus, with the church age, and ultimately, in Revelation. So the question, first question for basically studying this is, how did marriage naturally work in the ancient world? Which is a different question than saying, how did God want marriage to work? This is not really a question of God's intentions being, that he designed marriage and everybody in the ancient world followed his blueprint for how marriage should work. But he picked Abraham out of the people, and they already had customs at Babylon, at the Tower of Babel, at, Noah and his sons and all of this. So Abraham inherits a culture, and God doesn't immediately pile on a whole different style of thinking about the world. He doesn't teach him a whole new law and a whole new way of existing. So God essentially was using the framework that already existed, which may have been a corrupt framework. I mean, these people came out of the Tower of Babel system. It's like Noah's flood, Tower of Babel, Abraham. It's like very linked together. So we don't know of any reforms that would have taken place culturally between those points in time. So this is what I'm calling the natural way that marriage worked in the ancient world, where Abraham, or as he was known, Abram, came out of this tribe, and God set him apart to do a certain mission and give him this promise. So what we got to know is that men, this is sort of the basis of all of the marriage narrative in this ancient world. Men want to take other men's daughters for their own use, specifically those whom they find attractive or appealing. So a man walks wherever he's going. Families always stick together back then. The guy sees somebody's daughter. Every girl is somebody's daughter. And he wants to take that girl for himself. Very simple, very straightforward. But taking another man's daughter, is more complicated than it sounds, because these daughters are quite young usually. We're talking about back when, they might not have even hit puberty yet. And they're thinking, this is going to become a beautiful woman. I want to have her for myself. And so already we're not in the framework of modern society. So this is what's so interesting about God using this time and sort of this framework to set up his prophecies, because this could be an old man. It could be a 40-year-old man who says, this 8-year-old, I want that to be my wife. I want her to be my wife. Whose father, who is her father? And so a daughter belonged to her father as part of his household, along with his livestock, his wives, his children, his servants, etc. So the daughter is just essentially property. And taking a man's property, in this case a daughter, would be an act of thievery and disgrace against that man. So the woman, the girl, is not some separate... in our culture, obviously, parents have custody of children, but there's a point at which you stop basically being their custody and you become an adult, and then you have to go off on your own, or you can stay with them, but legally they're not your guardian anymore. You're your own guardian. In this culture, people wouldn't have waited that long, and that probably wouldn't have been a thing. You were just always belonged to your father. And so stealing somebody else's daughter would be very, dangerous and wicked. So it's basically treated like property. So it's therefore men had to bargain with the fathers for their daughters if they wanted, the daughters that they wanted, if They wanted to avoid retaliation and feuds. So, obviously you go in and you talk to the dad. You don't just take his daughter. I mean, it's a time before the legal system that God set up, hundreds of years before the Moses law. But there's a natural law of, if you take my stuff, I'm probably going to kill you, or I'm going to retaliate somehow. So they had to bargain. They had to say, how can I obtain your daughter? I think that's very simple, natural logic. You have a daughter, I want her. What do I have to do? So they bargained. And attractive daughters represented a profit opportunity, therefore, for any father. Think about that. I mean, in a way, this probably sounds very, like I'm describing a very sleazy, bad system, but it's not entirely different from how it works today. It's just dressed up more, and I'm trying to cut down all the dressing up down to this early ancient society and how they would have seen it. If you have a daughter you know that a lot of guys are going to want, essentially you can withhold her from the men in order to see who would give you the best offer for her. That's kind of how it still works, especially in high society, where a daughter is essentially not given all this freedom. So fathers would be thinking of their daughters as obviously a loved one, but also an opportunity for profit if they play their cards right. The asking price for a daughter could be anything. It's just a bargain. It's a direct bargain between two men over something that one man wants from another man. So, how much do you want my daughter becomes the fundamental question of that transaction. If the man doesn't really want the daughter that much, he just, wants another wife. Maybe he doesn't have a wife at all, but he just wants to get his first wife. Then he might not offer much. If he wants her very badly, he might offer to do all sorts of crazy things. But that is the question. How much do you want my daughter? Rich men can easily meet that price. So you would be able to go somewhere, see the selection, essentially, of all these daughters. There was different ways, from what we can tell, of basically presenting your daughter to all the other men, showing that she's a good servant, showing that she's modest, that she is respectful, that she would be a good fit as a husband. Like, for example, sending her out to go and feed and water somebody's livestock. That's kind of what happens in the Bible with, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. You see these different situations where the daughters are put in a position where they are still within, earshot of the family, household, and the tribe and stuff. But they're basically putting them out there. They have to do this work so that other men can see them. And obviously that gets their interest. And so rich men could come by, see the women, the girls. In some cases, it could just be, a young girl, and inquire about that. Obviously, if you're really rich, you would have your servants do it for you, which is what happened with Isaac for his son Jacob, or whoever. They sent a servant to go and find a wife and bring her back for the son. But a poor man would just have to earn the price by working for that father, and we see that too. So what I'm trying to emphasize, I'm not just trying to walk through this because it's interesting on its own. It's interesting because there's a theological parallel in prophecy, and because it shifts the moral conversation around marriage so far away from our modern idea of the romantic relationship but it still has its own sort of, you could romanticize this too. The man who works to earn the daughter, that's a romantic story. You didn't just meet somewhere and then decide we should be together, and then they they hook up and then they decide they have to get married or something. There's a story behind it, and that in the ancient world, that would have been considered basically romantic, the way that we think of romance. So the girl would know that the guy is serious and really wants her, and so if the father asks too much of these different suitors, he'll essentially be turning them away. But asking too little would be unprofitable, because you have a daughter, you raise her, feed her, clothe her, everything. And then if you basically just give her away, you probably could have gotten something more for that. So there, like I said, it's like a business, it's a profit opportunity. By that logic, if you play that out over a couple generations, having a beautiful wife increases the odds of having beautiful daughters, which in turn increases the price of one's daughters, leading to more profit in the long term. So if you got a beautiful daughter, she's going to go and marry somebody. If she produces beautiful daughters, then all of those daughters can go and get married to other men, hopefully rich men, and then for each one of them you get profit. Then obviously that can continue and continue and continue. And so daughters are this sort of, that's why you would want to pursue the most beautiful daughter, the most beautiful girl that you could, if you were thinking even just on a purely cynical business sort of level. You would want to have multiple wives. You would want to have beautiful wives, and you'd want to present, produce and then present beautiful daughters for other men, hopefully rich men, to come and pursue. If a man is rich, fathers will actually offer their daughters as wives to them, trying to make them more attractive so that the price can go higher. Because once you'd be rich enough, you would be able to just essentially walk in, and all of the fathers in that area would know that if you're looking for a wife, and you can have multiple wives, so there's no problem there if you're already married, everybody's essentially competing for your dollar and saying, here's my product. Like, I'm trying to make it sound cynical because it kind of is. I mean, you're trying to offer the daughter so that you can make money or establish this, friendly relationship between your household and his household. And so a rich man doesn't even really have to pursue women and then ask fathers for this or that. They can actually come and basically say, here, please take my daughter. Here's how much I would like for her. And then that becomes the trade. So to make the transaction pleasant and future connections of their families happier, the father of the daughter may bless the new son-in-law in various ways, and in doing so make it a matter of mutual gain. So we see that in the Bible too, where the man who's giving his daughter wants to give some nice things, as she's going, and that'll smooth things out so that the guy who's marrying the daughter won't be resentful. Because this is all comes down to tribes who could large families that essentially becomes tribes who could turn against each other at some point, and then they've got your daughter. And obviously that's kind of a ransom situation where if you love your daughter, you want to, and then you have grandkids through her, you want to have friendly relationships. So it's not just completely one-sided, although it could be if somebody's passing through and you're never going to see your daughter again, it might be a different situation. But these people didn't travel that far from each other. It's always basically a horse ride away. So you want to keep things peaceful. That's part of the marriage thinking. Marriages could be arranged between the fathers of a son and daughter without the future couple even meeting each other. So this is an arranged marriage where you say, well, my daughter is beautiful. She, does this and this, and she'd be a great match for your son. The other father says, oh yeah, well, my son, he's looking around, and, you basically work it out between the two of you. It doesn't really matter what the kids think. I mean, if it's bad enough, obviously it could be bad enough that they cancel the arranged marriage. I'm sure that happened, and, probably happened quite often. But in theory, this marriage could just be arranged, and then the children were expected to follow through with it and be nice and polite. And obviously that system continued like all the way until the 1900s. And it still happens in a lot of countries. So this is not foreign thinking. It's just foreign to our modern sensibilities. Now let's go to the bigger picture of this. And there's going to be some implications here that are interesting. So like the father is always the final authority. That's something that we don't have today. Fathers are basically constantly degraded, constantly downplayed, always, one bad week away from being divorced, always one step away from losing everything. There's never been a more precarious, dangerous time to be a father than today, ever in history. Always before this, there was more and more and more. Going the further back you go, the more the father is essentially the king of his own little kingdom. His house is he creates the laws. He literally can put people to death on his property. I mean, we're talking about a time here where doesn't even seem to be an established government. These are just tribes that go around and families that go around and deal with their own things. So the head of the household is not just a figure of speech. It is like a king ruling over his own kingdom. Everything and everyone belonged to the father, and he managed the affairs of his children for his own profit. So he had servants, he had wives, he had children, he had cattle, he had anything he acquired is his alone, exclusively. He can give things to people if he wants to, and then it becomes theirs and he no longer controls it. But everything he acquires is his, including the people. It's different than slavery, although in some cases slaves are literally property that a man would acquire, and then that's it. It's you belong to him. So even the affairs of the children, they never escape really that system. And the fathers, because the fathers and all the things they acquire, they get to choose which sons and which daughters they reward or deprive. So their future depends on gaining his approval. That's how stark this is. It's not like a big economic system where everyone is so independent that you can just leave home at 15 and go get a part-time job and then start working your way up, and eventually you just forget about your father and your mother, and you make your own future. That's a very modern idea. In most societies to this day, and certainly throughout history, if you wanted to have a good future, you needed to please your father, because he controls you, he controls your future. If he doesn't give you any inheritance, you're not going to just, your future is basically dead. And he can even take away whatever little bit you do have. Adam said that a man would leave his father and mother when he got a wife, and they would become one flesh. And that is not even how it's working here, because by now you have multiple wives for one man, and but you would leave your father and mother essentially and become the head of your own household when you got married. And, you'd probably be obviously connected to your father still, but you're expected to basically start your own household, and you would get a certain amount of benefit or reward from your father, inheritances, all that, blessings, the firstborn, blessings, and all those sorts of things are factors in how your life would play out. But it always comes back to that father being the central one. So acting independently of the father would have been dangerous. And this is something, again, like I said, nobody does today. But really, if God is the father, think about this. I mean, this is the subtext here that God is using when he sets up these covenants. You have to comply with what your father wants if you expect to have anything in the future. Dangerous to not do that. Girls were expected to retain their virginity and be desirable for suitors, not form their own relationships or seek men. That would have been a very strange concept for a girl to say, I'm going to go make my own friends. I'm going to go make my own connections. I'm going to just test out men and see how I can, what I like she's shopping for something. Very different mentality. It's no, my father is all that matters. My life literally depends on pleasing my father. My father can put me to death if I disgrace him. If I suddenly did have a boyfriend or some fling or something like that, and I give away my virginity, I could be killed. And everything that I get is going to depend on who I'm given to by my father. He could give me to somebody, if I'm a miserable, bad daughter, he might give me to somebody bad just almost to punish me, or whatever. It's a father-centric mentality. For girls, that would have been very clear. And being modest and a virgin is obviously, you can look at the Middle East culture, the Islamic culture, stuff like that to this day. It's very important to be a virgin because that's what men valued. Fertile, young women. Whereas sons were expected to profit the father's house by working for him and doing what it takes to get his blessings, seeking his blessings until you get a wife of your own. So being a good son is different. It's about being competent, being a good worker, handling a lot of the family business, whatever it is, and fighting for your family's, protecting the flocks from bandits and all the other things that would have been happening. You're essentially the workforce. You're the employees. You're the labor of the farm, assuming you don't have a bunch of servants. So, again, the parallel with Christianity, with the Old Testament, Mosaic religion, this is the backdrop that just sort of naturally fits in with all of it. The idea of serving God as a son means you're supposed to work. You're supposed to work, like you care about getting his blessings. I don't want to preach the subtext here constantly, but I'm hoping you're thinking about that. The fact that this all relates back to how God decided to establish his covenant and how he treats people, his own sons and daughters. In this society, which really isn't even a society, it's just a civilization that just sort of exists back then, having more children was always a good thing if they were obedient, because both daughters and sons profited the father in different ways, like I just explained. A barren daughter who can't have children was worth very little, much like a lazy or incompetent son, because what are you going to do with them? The father is not likely to bless you nearly as much, because if you're a daughter who can't have children, that means you won't have grandchildren. Whoever marries you is not going to profit by you, by having his own kids. And, an incompetent son doesn't work for you very well. So if he doesn't care, he's lazy, or if he just can't do it for some reason, that would have been a downgrade of that child, less likely to get those blessings than somebody who does a lot. Having influence with the father was your main source of power. So wives and children sought to gain his ear, to be loved enough that when you come and say, hey, I would like this, I think we should do things this way, he would actually listen to you and he'd respect your opinion. It's not that you go off and make a reputation for yourself independently of your father, and then you compete to see whether you can be better than your father. Until he dies, your future is linked to how much he likes you. So again, with Christianity, with the Bible, with God's way of setting up this relationship, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to go to God and pray to him, praying to the Father. That's what they would have done. They might not have called him a god, but they would have been essentially praying to the Father and saying, Father, forgive me for my incompetence. Help me to do what you want. Help me to work for what you have established to help your kingdom, your nation, your tribe. Help me to be a good child. And then when you ask for something, you never would ask out of entitlement. You would be asking out of a fearful love and trying to show your worthiness. So you want to have influence, and you'd have to try to seek it. That's the bigger picture. Very interesting, I think, because I didn't really think about it that way before. But when I study it, that's what I see. So now let's go into the related questions of this sexual and marriage question, which is prostitution and ambition. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So prostitution is the rental version of marriage back then. A man wants somebody's daughter. But instead of buying her as a wife and establishing a permanent bond between households, he pays for one night and gets, or day or whatever, and gets temporary gratification. So either way, the daughter is offered or offering herself, and the man is paying, but instead of becoming connection, it's just a usage and a discarding. So to offer to rent a daughter, essentially, of a different man would be extremely insulting to his father, much like today, since the father presumably attaches a high price to his daughter, even if he's poor. A poor man could have a beautiful daughter who's a great servant to the father and would be a great wife, and a rich man could come by and pay a fortune for even a poor man's daughter if it was if he fell in love with her. And so just saying I want to use your daughter and I want to rent her for, which is prostitution, that would have been like just fighting words. It would have been completely evil and insulting. Fathers could theoretically prostitute their daughters and try to make more money that way than they could get from a marriage. And poor fathers would be tempted to do so if they basically have no dignity, if they just say, because it's a man-centric world there. So for them to say, I want to make my household greater, I need money. My daughter is not worth that much to me for whatever reason. Maybe he hates his wife and he resents the daughter accordingly, or maybe the daughter is really a bad daughter and he just says, you know what, go and become a prostitute and go to the city hub and go where the prostitutes are, and whatever money you make, bring it back to me, and that's how I'm going to make money from you. It's something that happened. Prostitutes would therefore still be in the custody of a man and give earnings to him. You still wouldn't be, even if you're a prostitute, you still wouldn't be independent. Because without being in anybody's custody, if this girl was really just out on her own, nobody looking after her, she could simply be raped or taken as a slave, and there'd be no man to object. If she doesn't have a father, or her father doesn't care, she doesn't have a husband, she doesn't have some sort of protector, well, now nobody, who could you even complain to if somebody were to rape you or to, just steal you as a slave and say, you're mine now? So this is where even prostitution, I think, from what I can tell, is still a matter of some man decided that this was acceptable and she's working for him. Whereas playing the harlot, which is a term, a harlot is a prostitute who goes and makes money for sex. The daughter who plays the harlot is doing that for like a fling, a temporary thing, isn't really committed to it, isn't doing it as a constant source of income, but just finds it appealing for some reason and goes and does it. So girls wanted to be in somebody's custody. They didn't want to be on their own. They would never have wanted to be independent. And the reputation of children had implications for the father's household, which then impacted future business dealings and marriages. If you had a bunch of children that were doing whatever they wanted and being unruly and giving you a bad name, how are you going to attract the next suitor for your daughter, or present your son to somebody else and say, my son wants to marry your daughter? It all bodes badly for that future relationship if your other kids aren't in line. So that's why there would have had to been a very strict enforcement of the father's will, and a wise father would be one who watched out for bad behavior and cut it off so that all the future business dealings would be smooth. The household itself becomes appealing. But because even the reputations of these girls, the daughters, matter so much to the household, brothers and extended family would also be protective of their sisters and the girls in that family, even if there was no father. So, if you're a brother, there should be a natural affection and protection and loyalty between siblings and whatever. But even without that, even just on a cynical level, you would want your sisters and your family to stop a girl from going into prostitution. The more elevated a woman was in the household, such as being a proper wife, being his favorite wife of the wives that he had, the mother of his children, the mother of his favorite children, and so on, the more her honor mattered. So, you would want to protect the most honored woman in the house and make sure that she didn't do anything inappropriate or anything to disgrace the father. Again, it always comes back to the father. Whereas unfavored wives, barren wives, concubines, and servant girls would have less and less influence, or honor. So, you just would be there, but you wouldn't actually be listened to. And from a girl's point of view, you could see why, they would want to elevate themselves in this man's eyes, in the father's eyes, or the husband's eyes. Wives could be given servants that they owned, and therefore the husband would not be allowed to have sex with that servant. That's why you see in the Old Testament, the woman says, "Have my servant, bear children to my servant," and that's what happens with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so the man can't just go and take anyone he wants in his property and, any servants or anything, and just have sex with them if they belong to somebody else. But it's not that unusual, according to this, the Bible stories, that the man would be allowed to do so if the woman, for example, was barren and couldn't have kids. The servant becomes the proxy for that woman. If a girl servant was granted to sleep with the man of the house, she would hope to have his children and thus elevate her status and gain more influence. The dream of a girl would be to be the prized and honored wife of a rich and powerful man and earn his favor by having many children by him, influencing the operation of the whole household by having his favor. That's kind of the ultimate ambition, as opposed to a prostitute. That's why I said prostitution and ambition. The contrast between a girl essentially giving up on this dream and just renting herself and ruining her value to other men, whereas in this ideal situation, she becomes the prized wife who bears a lot of children, and then these children go on to make the father happy, make his house favorable and profitable, and have a good reputation. And you can see why this all snowballs into a system where everyone is trying to please the man of the house. Strangers, go and talk to the man of the house, make deals with him. The family is obeys him like a god or a king, and just does whatever he wants. And these girls who brought into the family as servants or as wives or concubines or whatever, they're all trying to become more favored by the head of the household. Now let's talk about deviancy, sexual deviancy. For a man to not even desire women was a sign of derangement. That is very strange. And that we know happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. So that is where the lawlessness, just could escalate in a region. And like I said, this is not a time where God was ruling all the nations and giving them laws and telling them what was right or wrong. But even so, there was sort of a natural logic and law to what was considered evil and deviant and what was healthy. What I described, even though it might sound evil from the modern point of view, that was considered the healthiest possible thing. That was considered righteous and good for a man to have a bunch of wives and some concubines and, have children by all of them and have all these men offering to take the daughters, the sons going and marrying other people's daughters, and this sort of household business with all the livestock and essentially this huge ranch or whatever you would think of it as. That's the good point of view. By today, that's demonized as being the worst thing that you could ever have, this patriarchal, one man rules his family with an iron fist sort of situation. But by contrast, we're told that, sexual deviancy is liberation and beauty and wisdom and good and everything. So we have a contrast between the ancient origins of civilization and the modern age. Which one do you think is more favored by God? Men who were so lustful that they were willing to disgrace themselves with animals or other men were considered abominable to God and to other men, or these other men who would have had sort of that God's way of thinking, you could say. Men who lusted after their own family members disrupted the logic of expanding the household business with outsiders, and they disgraced their father. So that's why a man leaves his father and mother to get a wife. You don't just stay there and marry your sister and then your grandkids marry each other and then you go on from there. Even without laws in place, because this is all before the Moses law, it just makes sense that you would say, no, go and make inroads with other powerful people, expand the household outward to new places, and let's essentially conquer land and raise the profile of our household so that when the father dies, you have a next in line and you have all these families being united behind each other and supporting each other in everything they need. And that's your safety net for everybody involved. And eventually, you get swords and you whatever, and you can protect yourself from invasions, and you become a city or an extended region. So if you just, incest would have been a total inversion of that. And for that reason alone, it would have been considered inappropriate and immoral. Reproduction and multiplying, as the Bible calls it, was the key to success and future prosperity. So anything other than a growing household would have been considered vanity at best. If you're doing a bunch of stuff, but you don't end up prospering the household for whatever reason, because this guy is sleeping around with animals, or he's going after men, or he's just abandoned his duties to become a father and have kids for his family, that would have, even a great accomplishments would be considered vanity, because your bloodline's not going on, you're not prospering the household. Now let's talk about the betrothal period, which is different than you might expect. So in order to ensure that the suitor would pay the full price that he's agreed to with the father, and that the father would honor the deal and give up the daughter to the suitor upon payment, a contract was necessary. And that contract is the legal marriage. That's what marriage was. When you get married, you make a contract with, the man makes a contract with a father for the daughter. Or I guess whoever is in custody of her. And that legal document says, you have given up this property to me, and in exchange, I'm going to pay you this and this much. And so marriage was really not romantic in that sense. The contract, whether it's verbal or otherwise, it's not the idea of this soulmate. The terms of the marriage were bargained and agreed upon and possibly written down, or at least witnessed, so that you could say, so that in the future, the father couldn't accuse that man of saying, hey, you just stole my property, you just stole my daughter. And the man can't say, that he paid when he didn't. And so both of them have to agree. It has to be witnessed. The terms are settled specifically to settle this question of possible future conflicts if either side accused the other of not living up to this agreement that they made. So I think that's fascinating. The idea of marriage, although, we know from what Jesus said and from Genesis that they're one man, one woman. She comes, out of his own flesh and is made specifically for him, and they have this union and how that's supposed to be. At the time when God is making this covenant, it's not like that. It's much more legal agreements between men for the women. Men and women, therefore, could be married for a long time before they actually consummated the marriage. That's why, 8-year-olds could get married to 30-year-olds, and, 5, 6, 7, 10 years later, that's when they would actually consummate the marriage and become a proper couple as we think of a married couple. And, or not, it wouldn't be the way we think of a married couple, but theoretically, that's how it would work. So when you hear about people in ancient times getting married, and they're getting married to these very young girls, it's not that they're pedophiles who want to have sex with a little girl necessarily, although who knows, that probably happened all the time, but rather that the marriage is established so that nobody else can have that girl. She belongs to this man until he's ready to have her. So it's like saying, like, dibs on this girl, so that once she blossoms into a woman, she can have his kids, and there's not going to be any question over who she belongs to. So marriage was very important, but it's not the idea that we have of this soulmate. This period of betrothal, which is what they would have called it, we could call it being engaged, although this was much more than being an engagement that you could break off. This is a legal contract. The betrothal period was of key importance on both sides, as anticipation built between the man and the girl, and the man worked to fulfill his obligations to the father. This has theological implications. I'm gonna get into that yet. The betrothed woman was still in custody of the father, but the husband was literally invested in her purity and her upheld value. So until the contract is fulfilled, and then the man gets to take the woman and say, you're mine now. You no longer belong to your father. You belong to me. You do what I say. I get to do what I want with you. You're going to have my kids. This is our life together now. Say goodbye to all that stuff that you used to know. Until that period, he's investing in her, and therefore, obviously, she should be remaining as pure as possible, so that by the time the contract is fulfilled, he doesn't feel like he's been defrauded. So you're married and a wife of a man. That's where the questions of adultery and these things really become important. Since girls were often married young, they would bloom into beautiful women during the period of their betrothal, which would increase her desirability to the groom, but also to other men. So obviously you're going through puberty, and all the other men who would see this daughter, this girl, would also want to have her, but she would be expected to wear a veil, to do what she can to make herself off limits to other men and not seek any attention from any other man, because that would just increase problems and drama for the father and for the husband. For a betrothed girl to debauch herself by having sex with another man would both destroy that marriage and thus cancel the transaction, but it also disgraces her family. So there's huge implications for a girl who would be betrothed to not keep herself pure. Some men were willing to pay the price of the woman despite her adultery because they were in love with her. We actually have an example of that in the Bible. I don't remember who it was. Joshua, somewhere around there, maybe. Don't quote me on that. There was a man whose wife ended up prostituting herself, essentially, and he goes and buys her from the marketplace. And I believe it even says in there that God told him that that's how he feels as well about, his unfaithful nation, his bride that is always cheating on him, that he still wants to buy her. I believe I haven't looked that one up yet, but I did hear about that, and I remember it. So fathers could try to cheat by finding fault with the man, or they could renegotiate the price of the daughter during the betrothal period if the man was in love enough. And we have an example of that where I believe it was Jacob, who ended up having to earn his, the man changed his wages 10 times, and he ended up, having to work extra years to get Rebecca and Leah, whoever it was. So this is where the politics of whether a man ends up with the woman he wants is actually a very involved process. It's not some sort of quick thing where the man and the woman agree to be with each other. The father is basically not asked, and then who cares? They go off on their own like it is today. No, the father could actually basically cheat and say, no, you have to pay me more now. Or, what you did for me, I asked you to do this, but I'm not satisfied with the work you did, so you have to do more for me. And exploit the love between those two in order to make more money, in order to profit more. That's how established this sort of system was. And if a man was truly in love, which did happen, I mean, these aren't monsters, then he might even just go along with that and say, okay, I'm going to still do what you want because I want your daughter. But other men can come in and try to disrupt that betrothal period and woo the girl away, or win the father's approval and offer a better deal. So the betrothal period is this vulnerable time where things can change. The girl can lose her value. She can increase her value. The man can do something to disgrace himself. The contract is there, but there might even be terms in the contract where the man might do something so bad that, it nullifies it in theory. But there's other men could come in and try to compete over this girl. And the father is going to be there, taking offers essentially. So because of this whole system and how complicated it can get, contracts were increasingly important as the culture develops. It might have started as just a man and his word, but it might have, gotten more and more like a real contract that had to be set out and established. And so even just from that alone, a legal system, you can see why it would develop and evolve, and laws and contract law would become increasingly important because there's a lot of opportunity for trickery and fraud and gray areas and disputes, and that's not what these men want. So let's talk about having multiple wives and concubines. Since marriage was mostly about a transaction between a father and a suitor for his daughter, polygamy was a non-issue. Polygamy is when you have multiple wives. So marrying your daughter to a wealthy man who could afford multiple wives was just good. It bode well for your daughter. Oh, you can afford multiple wives? Good. That means my daughter will probably be successful and will probably contribute to your empire that you're growing. It wasn't considered evil. It wasn't sinful at all. It was just the way that the world worked. And there's no reason to disparage it as being fornication or adultery or evil. You're not cheating on your wife in this system. You're just increasing your household by getting more wives. Men had no obligation to be monogamous or faithful in the sense of strictly having sex with only their first wife. This is where, again, there is actually a theological implication. And I know that that's very weird, and I don't want to say too much until the points are established, but if you think about it, in that old system, adultery is, well, maybe I talk about it in the next slides here, but adultery is when you have sex with another man's wife, not when a married man has sex with somebody other than his wife who's not married. So it's a kind of a one-way thing. If a woman ends up cheating on her husband, that's adultery, and the man who's involved with that is punished, but the man is not obligated to be faithful like we think of being faithful. The women he obtained were expected to compete for his affection and his impregnation. Having more kids by a man meant you were more favored and blessed. Your children were more likely to get his inheritance, and you were expected to get, a greater inheritance if he died before you, and everything just hinged on how much this man liked you. So the women would just compete, as women do, and then in this case, they'd be fighting over this man. We see that very clearly in the Bible, where these early patriarchs, one wife was trying to do what she could, and the names of the children that they have end up being, puns based on the fact that God opened their womb and let them have another kid, and they have these like little sayings that they give. I have finally recaptured my man from his other wife, and blah blah blah. So that's how much it wasn't an issue for the man to have multiple wives or be unfaithful, as we would think of it, when he has concubines, servants, and other wives. That just wasn't part of the picture. Other men would envy men who had wives and concubines. So you would see somebody who has, 3 wives and 4 concubines, and you'd say, I want to be like that man. So far from saying that's a disgraceful man, he should be charged with crimes, that was status. That was saying you're like a king. You have everything. Your house is growing. You're having lots of kids. A woman can only be pregnant once at a time, one kid at a time, unless they have twins or whatever. But you can't re-impregnate her. So you'd have to have multiple wives if you want to quickly grow your household. And so the idea of having a bunch of wives and making each of them pregnant or concubines or whatever would have been just more efficient for the system. The man doesn't have a period where he can't have more kids. And that's, from the natural logic of God's design. And if it sounds like I'm justifying this, I'm not. I'm just looking at, if anything, I'm just trying to justify how God designed mankind and what he ended up modeling his own covenant after. So what should I say about it? He would end up having as many kids as he could, and that was a good thing. Coveting a man's wife or man's wives or anything in his property naturally led to attempts to defraud him by taking what he had. So coveting is, even before the Moses law, something you could see why it would become a law. Why God would say, do not covet your man's wives, his donkeys, his camels, anything he has, because it's intended to maintain the system and avoid the drama. That's a psychological law in the 10 Commandments, to not covet. But it directly implies that if you did something in order to cheat him or obtain what he had, you're supposed to respect that man as a sovereign, independent lord, in the old sense of the word lord, where you're just a master of your household. So you don't mess with another lord. You're supposed to go become your own man, earn your own stuff, please your father, get your blessings from him, get started your own way like we've been talking about. But coveting what another man had, even if he had much more than you, all these wives and children and stuff he was having, that you're not supposed to even do. So the stronger condemnation, this is sort of where the morality really flips around. Far from condemning men for wanting to have multiple wives and, really romanticizing this one-on-one relationship between a man and his wife, his first wife, it was actually that you were condemned if you coveted that stuff that the other guy had. Respect him, leave him alone, let him have what he has. You worry about your own stuff, and that was where the punishment laid. It's a very different way of thinking about it. So all respect for marriage, which remember, that's the contract. Marriage was not the holy union sort of idea. It was all born out of respect for a man and his property, not the sacredness of the holy union. So, again, this is just so different. Concubines were obtained by conquest or some other means than a marriage, and it was natural to have children with them as well. We see that in the Bible, though they would be less favored because they were not obtained by this contract. A concubine wouldn't have, that father or household that is looking after her, so you don't have to be as nice to her because you're not insulting her family if you treat her worse. That's why they don't have that same level of status. And so that's also why if you destroy a whole village or whatever and the family's gone, you can just take their daughters as captives and not have to marry them, because marriage was basically a way of saying, I'm going to treat your daughter well. I'm going to pay a price for her. Obviously, if I'm paying a price for her, I'm not just going to abuse her. And, I know that you could come after me if I treated her badly enough, if I disgrace your family enough by treating your daughter badly. Your household could come against my household. I don't want drama, so I'm going to treat her as a proper wife with a contract in place. And that's what's going to keep our households from feuding with each other. And we're going to have stability instead of explosions and drama. A concubine is not like that. So it's like, you belong to me now. If you're nice, I'll feed you and keep you alive. If not, you could get yourself killed if you're a concubine and you were doing something that the man thought was worthy of that punishment. Growing the household by the man having sex with many women who belonged to him was a straightforward virtue. Not even a little bit immoral or compromised or sleazy. It was actually just a virtue to grow your household by having many children. Obviously, we can see by the end of the Bible that the ideal once again becomes to have the single bride. And Jesus talks about how in the beginning, he reminds the Jews that God made Adam and Eve and they were supposed to be one flesh. So we know that ultimately that was kind of like a reminder to the ideal for God was to have one man and one woman. But it is a completely false argument to say that that's always how it was. God never had any mercy towards people who are doing this. No, far from it. To have many children by many women under your custody, under your ownership, was a virtue because growing your household was a good thing. So let's talk about fornication. What's the difference? Why would that not be fornicating if you had sex outside of marriage, which is what a concubine would be, not married? Why is that not considered fornication? Because fornication is primarily prostitution. not just sex with somebody outside of marriage. Girls would play the harlot or act like a prostitute if they felt rebellious or were lustful in their whatever age they are. They could go and, like I said, pretend to be a prostitute. And, when they're impatient for sex or some marriage opportunity, a girl could pretend to be a prostitute, visit a city or a known hub of prostitution in order to earn money and experience sex with wealthy men who could afford to, or, however wealthy they were, they could afford her. And since wealthy men were highly regarded and their interest in prostitutes carried no shame for them, there was no shame for a man going to a prostitute, then it was not considered an act of desperation on his part. And because it wasn't considered an act of desperation that he went to go see a prostitute, then that act of seeking a prostitute wouldn't have been considered unattractive to women, because it was just sort of, hey, men are men. If they're in the city and their wives aren't there, then they're going to look for a prostitute. That was just the straightforward logic of the situation. And we can see that in the Bible too. Men who go, Jacob or whoever it was that goes to this prostitute, he ends up having sex with his sister or his daughter-in-law. And there's this whole thing, but the man is never condemned as being evil for doing so. She's condemned for playing the harlot and for prostituting herself, but he isn't. And so that explains the whole ancient world system of prostitution being very prevalent and women being condemned if they were betrothed or for some reason they were disgracing their family by doing this. But women wouldn't have even thought that it was bad for a man to go and seek a prostitute in the city. If she was jealous, a jealous personality type, which not every woman was, then she could complain and say, why aren't you using me? Why go after a prostitute? And there's the jealousy factor, which is not about legal status. It's not about a moral thing that other men would judge that man for. It's not about other women would judge that man. It's just a personal thing between that man and the wife that is jealous. And so it could be considered bad in that way, but it's not this great sin, according to that ancient logic. Girls who got pregnant this way through playing the harlot or fornication would have to deal with the problem without the father of the child caring. So, obviously you get pregnant from some man who comes by and hires you for sex. He's not going to stick around and take care of that kid. So that's a very obvious fault. And you can see why God would not want that to be done, because having a bunch of bastard children who don't know their fathers and breaks up that whole system, that leads to extra problems in the future. Hiding their pregnancy would be difficult and likely end in that woman, that girl, being punished, cursed, killed, disowned, or otherwise abandoned by her family, since she now has no value as a bride, or very little, and she's humiliated her father's household. So basically, when you would go to fornicate, to be a prostitute, you would be jeopardizing your own life. You would be disgracing your family. You'd end up having a kid that nobody wants to take care of, and nobody would feel sorry for you because you've done an evil thing. And the man is not considered bad for being a man and wanting to have sex with a prostitute who offers herself, but the woman is considered to be a disgrace for going away from her father's household, out of his custody, and offering herself like that. Again, very different way of thinking about it. I don't like that kind of society, but I'm just trying to communicate how this was set up so that we can not end up judging God for basing his covenant around some of these ideas. Bastard children, male or female, would end up in servitude or death one way or another. because you don't belong to any. If you're just the child of a prostitute, you didn't. There's no father to help you around, and so the father was everything, like we've been saying this whole time. Doesn't matter who your mom was. If the father's not there, you're not going to get an inheritance. You're going to have to end up selling yourself into servitude, and then if you're a woman, you're probably going to end up becoming a prostitute yourself, or selling yourself into servitude or whatever. And so you could try to start from there. But the man who was biologically your father would just have no obligation to do that. And for a different man to come in and marry a woman who has children would be insane, in that system, because there would just be better offers other places, and it's a straightforward transaction to get a wife without having to resort to that, essentially taking a prostitute for a wife. Ultimately, we have to talk about bloodlines. Having a complete history of a bloodline was proof that one's family and heritage was honorable and likely to continue being so. So you know who your father was, you know who his father was, his mom, everything significant going back far enough. And that proves that you didn't have any bad apples in that line. And there's people who very much care about that today. They try to trace their family tree as far back as they can because they take that as a mark of pride, and therefore your children would be disgracing you and their ancestors if, like, disgracing a bloodline meant essentially throwing away your whole history of your ancestors while upgrading in life, upgrading your status, was like redeeming your bloodline and your ancestors, or benefiting your ancestors. So again, this line of having many children, many branches on that tree, you can trace which ones are the most prosperous and say, I come from this line. All of my fathers were great. Maybe somebody else could say, well, my fathers were all trash except the one guy, at the top that I have in common with this great man. We share the same initial patriarch, forefather, ancestor. But the more blessed your family line is, the more it speaks well of you and your chances. It's a superstitious thing, obviously. But in this old society, inheritances also pass along who is the most favored, right? So who is the most favored, whoever obtains the most inheritance is usually going to be the most virtuous, hardworking, appealing, charismatic, whatever you want to say, all the virtues you could think of for a man. Wherever that inheritance passes through, if you're in that line and the closer it is to you, the more you would feel like these must have all been good people in my line of family because we ended up earning that value, earning that inheritance from our ancestors. Whereas if you ended up with nothing, you were born and then you ask your dad, why don't we have anything? He'd say, well, because I didn't earn any inheritance from my dad and he didn't earn any inheritance from his dad. And we're from a long line of people who never inherited anything. Then obviously that speaks badly of your family's history and says, you end up with nothing because you didn't earn it. I mean, obviously there could be a tragedy. Obviously there could be a lot of reasons why you don't end up with something, but this is the normal logic. If we don't get this right, we don't understand the whole idea of blessings, inheritances, the idea of pleasing your father, and why that's so centrally, completely the center of your whole life. Everything you do in life from a young age would be about pleasing your father and your ancestors, and therefore becoming the most favored of your generation so that your generation that you produce, you can choose who to bless among those children. So if you have, 3 sons and you bless this one more than the other ones, you're saying this is the kind of thing I want to endorse as being good. So the morality sort of passes on through the inheritance. And then those who you dishonor or you curse even, you're cutting them off. And you're saying you're less likely to reproduce. You're less likely to create offspring. You're less likely to prosper in the timeline of this bloodline because we didn't endorse what you want. And so passing down values, passing down a certain tradition, a certain way of thinking, all of it has very deep ramifications as the system compounds on itself and it becomes more and more elaborate and sophisticated and involved. But it starts with that simple premise that we've been talking about, of the father being the central character and passing on everything to the sons and daughters that he likes the most. Fathers showed favor to their best children in order to encourage the kind of thinking and reinforce the logic of a strong bloodline. Cultures thus naturally ended up revering their ancestors and eventually worshiping them in order to hope that their spirits would pass down blessings from beyond the grave. It's not a leap in logic to say that if everything in my life depends on pleasing my father, and everything in his life depended on pleasing his father, my grandfather, I should also want to please my grandfather because he might have something to offer me, even though he's dead. And if he's still alive, which could happen if you're having children very young, you could have great-grandchildren and see them and know them. All those blessings, the idea of trying to please your ancestors as high up in the chain as possible, it just makes logical sense. You would want to please especially those ancestors who were the most blessed. When you think about that tree, you want to go down to the most blessed person in your heritage, in your lineage, and live up to and honor that most successful person, and then the next most successful person, the next most successful, and you would hope to essentially merge back into that prosperous line, and you'd be constantly wanting to remember and honor that ancestor. And it becomes a spiritual thing because they're dead, so obviously you can only talk to their spirits. And then this gets into really where the Bible starts to shine as a commentary within that framework, the idea of gods of households. Men could worship any god they wanted. We're not talking, the whole world did not revolve around God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's a reason why he was the God of Isaac, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because he wasn't the God of anyone else. And so we have Melchizedek, who's the high priest of God Most High somehow, but these, men would pick their own God, and they'd say, this is the one I want to try to help me to grow and to prosper. So let's say we're just starting off with a man who has very little lineage right after the flood. There really wouldn't be, everyone would just come from Noah and his family. So you'd have this short lineage and say, okay, which God am I going to have? And those who prospered in that society, in that culture, would have assumed that their God was stronger than the other gods. If I had a God and I ended up getting everything I wanted, you had a God and you ended up getting nothing you wanted, obviously I'm going to assume my God was really helping me out and he's better than yours. Multiplying a family, therefore, like we've been talking about this whole time, suggested the increasing power of a God they served. So I would tell my kids, we serve this God, and as you can see, it has helped me. So you should also serve this God, because if we all serve this God together, we're all going to be blessed by this God that I serve. And being personally known by that God would have been how much more amazing. You could literally tell them stories of how this God made a promise to you, or a covenant with you, or a deal with you. And other people besides Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were doing this. They had other gods. And they had divination. They had other things they could talk to, or at least they tried to, and they would say, I'm getting my blessings from this God. He's always looked out for me. My kids, you all have to serve him too. As our family grows and next generation, it's not just our family that's growing. It's our God that is growing. And that can be the unifying principle behind all these different families, is that you all serve this same God. And if you're successful, obviously you're magnifying that God in the process. So another way of thinking about it is that gods, therefore, could multiply their strength and their veneration by conquering households. If one God, if I serve a certain God and I get married to your daughter and she becomes my property, I'm taking her away from your God and bringing her to my God. And so mixing these two households, it diminishes that household. But then if she has kids, then we're kind of merging. So you see these other gods, and the politics around the gods can be its own thing. We know from, again, I'm going to mix up whether it's Isaac or Jacob, but he had this wife who ended up stealing the gods of her father's household when she was leaving. I think it was Jacob. She ends up leaving and stealing his gods, whatever that means. So obviously it was an idol of some kind, and she tucked it under her seat. And then when he came and said, hey, one of your people stole my gods, didn't say he just stole a piece of wood that symbolizes a god. The Bible talks about it like he stole the god itself. So they had whatever charms they had, whatever trinkets, whatever pieces of things. It was small enough that it could fit underneath this girl's seat when she was sitting. And he went and looked for that god. And so right there you have an example of this ancient society before the Moses law, where a household had a god and it was valuable to them. And meanwhile, this other guy, Jacob, he had his own god. And so he wants to get blessings from this God and from this God, and he's serving multiple gods. And no wonder that's how that system worked. You ended up serving multiple gods. If I end up marrying from 3 different households, I have 3 different wives, and each of them has a different god. They bring their gods to me. I now think, hey, I'm going to get blessings from 3 different gods at once. 4 different, because I have my own. You see how that works? You see how spiritually that becomes a fornication? Why God doesn't want there to be any other gods involved? It's so amazing. The marriage theme is actually amazing when you really respect what that early civilization was about. So multiplying your house was multiplying a god's strength. Combining houses would be the same way. Getting a wife from a certain area would be, in a sense, participating in that God's people. And unless you take that wife and say you have to reject the God of your father's household and serve mine and exclude the other people, the other gods from participating and you just have one God and you only rely on that one God ever, you would end up having multiple gods involved. And secretly, one of your daughters, she could flirt with or fall in love with some man who has a different God and bring one of his idols in, and secretly she's worshiping this God while you dedicated your household to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or Baal, or whoever it is. You now find out she's essentially disgracing your God in your household. That itself becomes its own political struggle. And we know that God of the Bible says no other gods. I don't want anyone involved. And we can analyze this. Obviously, you could analyze this, for months and years if you wanted to, but that's why I'm trying to just stick with the framework here so that you can think of the implications afterwards. But sex rituals in the name of gods makes logical sense because all of the aspects of worldly success involved sex. So you would have a ritual around it, such as the virility of a man, his ability to produce children, his sexual vigor or appetite, even if he's potent and can have kids when he does have sex, if he doesn't have a lot of sexual appetite, then that would also be a factor of how much his house is going to grow. So more children, fertile young women, making sure that young women are actually able to bear children, and how many children are they able to bear. Women died in childbirth, and so surviving a childbirth was a big deal. And we know from Garden of Eden's curse with Eve that pain in childbearing, men would have been thinking that a woman who died in childbearing or bearing a child was essentially suffering from the curse that God put on women. And maybe she was more cursed than others if she died from having one kid. Whereas a woman who has 10 kids, she's obviously very blessed and doesn't suffer that much from that curse. So God is favoring this woman because he allows her to have more children without suffering the curse and ended up dying in childbirth. It's all tied to this logic. Or I should say the logic comes out of the reality of what the Bible describes. Having money to pay the bridal price, that's success, because if you can't afford to have a bunch of wives, then you're not going to have as many kids as somebody who does have many wives. So money itself is, part of this ritualistic sex magic thing where you'd want to combine gods with sex with money, because success means offspring, money to pay for wives, money to support a family, etc. The power to conquer other people, other families, and steal their daughters and take them as brides also leads to more children. So physical strength, actual muscles on your arms, lung capacity, running speed, all of the things that, we think athleticism for the sake of vanity, of feeling, feeling important or special or being attractive, back then would have been actual virtues, because you could kill men with primitive weapons they had, spears or whatever, and take their women, and then they couldn't fight back. Because we're not talking about nation states with giant armies fighting each other in a legal framework. We're talking about tribes and nomads and grazing people and tribes with tents. And if you went by and stole, literally just kidnapped their women, and they physically couldn't fight back, then that meant you got to have more kids than they had. Your future looked brighter and theirs looked dimmer. It's as simple as that. So that is also part of this system. The power to take concubines as trophies, that's the same thing. You don't even marry them, you're just taking their women. Large households being an armed force. So I don't just go out on my own because I want to capture slaves and women and whatever. I would bring all my brothers and cousins and, uncles, and we'd all go and do this thing so that we all can divide the spoils between us. That's the logic of this civilization. And so it becomes a tribal power. All of these things add up to being tribal power. Are your men strong? Are your women fertile? Are you virile or virile? Are you sexually vigorous? Are you always ready to have more kids? These are just virtuous things because it makes your household stronger. It's all about that household. So the tribe becomes tribal power, and you have the power to destroy rival tribes if they're on good land. Obviously, whichever land you're on is going to produce better crops, crop yield, ability to have more animals, more grain, everything. It all ties in with the idea of multiplication. It was never a system. This is what I'm trying to get at. It was never a system that was designed by some smart person or a god and said, this is how I want you to set up this civilization. And then they all respect each other, and the system plays out based on laws or commandments from gods who say, no, don't do that because I say so. No, we're seeing that it's a natural progression. And so all of this, including the prosperity of gods and worshiping gods, is just the natural logic that comes out of this worldview. So tribes, which are just extended households, my family plus your family plus our brother's family plus, all of our relatives become this tribe. And if we stick together and we protect land physically together, we're a tribe. So this is where it becomes amazing. We're talking about gods, right? So, your God is stronger than somebody else's. You multiply, therefore your God multiplies. You have sex rituals. You have cults around sexuality. You do what you can to build up your strength, and you praise your God for it. If you have a strong son, you'd thank your God and say, thank you, God, for this son who's athletic and can help me conquer my neighbor or protect my fields or whatever it is. And so in that sense, the tribe itself becomes like a woman, and they have a father/husband, which is a god. The god is like a father because it is what gives you inheritance. It's what offers you what you have. But collectively, your tribe treats your God like a husband that you're wedded to, and that God can have other tribes that serve it. You see? This is why monogamy is not part of this equation in the slightest. Because other gods end up having multiple tribes serving them like wives, and each wife wants to have as many offspring as possible and be as favored as possible in the eyes of that god in order to please that god the most. Whoever has the most children wins. Cattle, grain, land, all of those things are factors that help determine how well you can feed your family. Really nourished wives and men create more healthy children, and the children grow up healthier if they have good things to eat. So the land is a factor for that reason. But ultimately, the whole tribe, the connected households, are all thinking of how they can serve their gods the most in order to get the most blessings for their tribe. Therefore, they act like a woman, and the god is like both a father and a husband, because the tribes are in the custody of their god, like a daughter slash wife is in the custody of her father slash husband. Everything you get from your god, whether it's indirect or direct. In human terms, your father or your husband could gift you something, or they could just set up circumstances in such a way that you indirectly get blessed, because they gave you part of their land that was nice. So they don't have to personally give you the nice things, but because they set up your situation in a certain way, you now end up in a better off position than somebody else. And so it's an indirect blessing. That's exactly how it would be with these gods in their minds, where they would have blessings based on where they could live, what they got away with, how much they were growing, and so on. So the tribes become daughters and wives, and the gods become fathers and husbands when you collectivize it. Like a woman, tribes ideally multiply and grow, like a wife who bears children for her man. When a wife doesn't bear children, the man is not happy. I mean, he might still love her, but she wants to bear him children so that she can honor him. And it's just the straightforward logic of, what am I worth if I can't produce children? He wants to have children. I'm not able to give it to him. That's the simple logic. A tribe would be the same way. If a tribe of households, for whatever reason, ends up failing to prosper, their generations, their branches on their family tree are snuffing out, and this one got killed, this one was barren, this one didn't have enough food, so they sold themselves into slavery, these ones, blah, blah, blah. Any which way you could end up getting cut off from this prosperity, you would be like a woman. As a tribe, you'd be like a woman who doesn't produce offspring. And those who multiply more are the more prosperous woman to their man. And tribes who act like harlots and prostitute themselves, i.e. fornicate, with other gods, are disgracing their father, God, or else adultering against their husband, God. This makes the most sense in the Abraham, Isaac, Jacob jealous God. Notice that? God is a jealous God. He doesn't want to share his wives. He doesn't want to share his property. He is greedy for his own household. He wants there to be a lot of growth in his household without sharing his people with any other gods. Now it makes sense from a ancient world perspective, without having to force on attributes onto God that seem like he's mysteriously completely disconnected from our way of thinking. Satan has tried to get us to think completely differently than God. But to these people, nothing could be more obvious, more self-evident than why a God would say, I am a jealous God, do not have other gods, because I am like a man who doesn't want my wife to cheat on me. You're my wife, you're my daughter, you're my people. You have to serve me and get all of your blessings from me and me only. You don't get to get blessings from other people also. Exclusivity, fidelity, all of these things tie back into the core marriage theme. So tribes who end up going after other gods and saying, God hasn't been blessing us. Israel can say, God has really not been helping us this much. These guys over here are better than us. They've got 10 different gods, and no wonder they're doing so well because they've got 10 different gods. We've only got this one God, and, he's not doing that much for us. Maybe we should just go and, quietly worship these other gods, and then we can get blessings from them. God says, no, this is wickedness and evil, and I'm going to punish you for it because you're fornicating. You're acting like a prostitute. You're betrothed. You're a wife. You're a daughter. Either way, you're under his custody, and he wants to profit from you, but he doesn't want to share. So, you'd be disgracing God by going to another god. Loyalty to the God of your tribe is therefore equivalent to loyalty to your real father or husband to whom you owe everything. Loyalty counts in this system. You can be killed by your father or by your husband if you disgrace them. And there's not going to be a lot of people who are going to miss you. Like, your existence depends on them. So the fact that you would disgrace them is asking for death. That's how they would look at it. And that's true with God. If you go after other gods, if you have some other source for your blessings, then no one should feel sorry for you if you fail. That's the logic. Everything hinges on God, and he is the one who wants to give you blessings, but he's only going to give you blessings if you're loyal to him. Just as fathers and husbands protect their daughters, gods protect their tribes. That should also be straightforward. A father is expected to give his daughter to the best suitor he can for a high price. Now we're right back to the beginning, the very beginning. Fathers give their daughters to the best suitor he can for a high price. And in the Bible, that suitor is that tribe's chosen one. And that is where we're going to leave this lecture, because we have now gone from the very roots of ungodly society to a perfect explanation for why the metaphors and themes of the Bible lead up to Jesus being the chosen one. Jerusalem being the bride, the church being the bride, Jesus being the husband, the groom, the betrothal period. All of it comes from this. But this lecture was about establishing the logic so that we can build from there. And I hope you're excited to explore this more, because Jesus is that suitor. And there's so much we could say about it, but I'm going to stop it there. Thank you very much for listening.